So Jeff, thank you very much for joining us here on AU Manufacturing Conversations. It's very nice to finally have you on the program.
Thanks for the opportunity, Brent.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Let's get started the way we normally do, and that is with the question, how did you get here and what do you make?
Okay, so I've had a very interesting journey over the years. I started life really pretty much the classic sports jock at school. So I wasn't too over academically focused, more focused on sport. So I left school in 82 as my final year 12. But then I got involved I was doing high-level athletics, and believe it or not, I was the youngest sponsored person by Nike at the time. I got sponsored by them when I was 16 years old for high jump of all things in athletics. So I followed that process through with the AIS and other areas, but then I pulled out of that when I was actually 18, 19 for one simple reason. I had a potential career there, but there was no money in athletics back in the 80s. So I thought, okay, this is not going to work too well. So instead, my father had quite a large manufacturing business in Melbourne. It was a sign business back in the old day before all the digital aspect. And so I got heavily involved in that bit, and I did an apprenticeship there in a trade. Actually started life as a tradie, as a signwriter. And there's a joke with signwriters, we're the jack of all trades. So it was a really good founding for me in two aspects. One is to learn everything about various different trades. But I was also very lucky at the time that back in the 80s, I was one of the first people to get involved with the computers in manufacturing back in 83, where we had one of the first stylus cutters, which was basically the preamble to how a lot of the digital stuff works now. In that situation, we were cutting sticker material with a stylus cutter to create letters to replace the old traditional sign writing, which was by hand, by paint. So I actually was lucky to see that go through from the first machine we had that were made from 3M, which would just cut individual letters, to then going through digitisation, even computer screens. When we first started, there wasn't even a screen. And I've just been lucky to follow that journey digitally through from early 80s through to now, through initially into three-dimensional CNC machining, then into robotics and into full automation. So I've been lucky in the right place, right time with my age. I'm the oldest of Gen X. I've just turned 60 this year. But I've been able to follow that digital era through from when it really first started to now, seeing how it has impacts in manufacturing. Over the years, that's led to me doing different things. So I ran my father's business for a while and built that bit up, but I got bored quite quickly. So I always had an interest in technology. But also the problem with interest in technology, you're always looking for that next thing. So to apply that commercially is a rule set I've learned over the years, and had to be quite diligent to not go off on tangents and really stay focused on commercializing technology rather than the excitement of exploring inventions in other areas. So that's seen me over the years go through different areas. Now, I come back to the sport again, because then when I was in my early years, snowboarding became quite big in Australia. So I was one of the pioneer snowboarders in Australia, and then sort of built that up. I saw the opportunity there, had a crazy idea that I could actually make snowboards. So my father had some equipment in the factory, so I started making some early snowboards back in the mid-80s, and then sort of built that bit up. So then that led to me competing in snowboarding as well, and also downhill skateboarding as well. And over that career, won a few X Games events and other stuff, but it's hard on toll on the body. So, I pulled out of that. But I realized there was a bigger opportunity in the commercial side of the snowboard industry, which was around manufacturing products. So that led me down a journey of working with the Europeans, learning how to manufacture different skis and snowboards, and at the same time, incorporate that technology to bring it back into Australia. So in the early 90s, I built a snowboard factory in Melbourne, and actually was making composites. So we were doing really well there, and that took a long time to build that up over a 10-year period, and created a company called Force Industries back then. And we were producing skis, snowboards, and at the time, kiteboards were coming onto the market. So kiteboards were made like surfboards. So instead, I started to make them more like a ski construction, and that went globally. So we had a lot of success there. But that also taught some lessons about manufacturing in Australia. And one lesson I got through that period was just my cost to land materials from Europe to make a ski or snowboard was the same cost I could bring a finished product in from China. So then I had to really sort of look at the economics of manufacturing here in Australia and try to find that value proposition. So that's where we came up with a new technology and that process. And obviously we did some good sales and got into Japan in those early years. So that was my first really understanding of global manufacturing or global supply chains. And then since then, I've done quite a varied things over the years. That factory we ended up losing it with my partners, had some investment in. They wanted to move to China. I did everything to try to oppose shipping that off to China, that capability, but we ended up doing it. So that was back in 2004. We shipped over to China. And then by 2007, I built the third largest ski factory in the world that produced skis, snowboards, kiteboards, other products. That year, 2007, I won an award for the best foreign expat in China in the Ningbo region for helping them actually learn the manufacturing. I wasn't too popular in Europe for a while there because they really take a lot of pride in their ski manufacturing history. And so here's this Aussie setting up manufacturing in China. I really pissed off a few people there. But anyway, that led to down that pathway. We've still got that company up and running now, still one of the largest factories in the world producing skis, snowboards and kiteboards. But I also led down a path of developing a few other sports products as well that I won some awards in Europe for and elsewhere as well. But ultimately, that then came back from over in Europe. So obviously, mainly fundamental about producing sports products, selling them, and also manufacturing them. But when I came back to Australia, I'd always involved in robotics and other areas, and I did some work with specialised plastic engineers, giving talks about latest trends in plastics out of Europe. So always really intrigued in technology and also material science as well. So started bringing them together, and then out of the blue in late 2007, the CSIRO gave me a call, said, look, we've got a new project underway. We've got this cold spray technology. We'd like you to get involved in this direct manufacturing centre. We've got some quite large grants out of the government. Would you be interested? We know you have a great background in sports products. So it initially enticed me to be involved with the CSIRO around cold spray to look at where we could implement that technology into sports products. I very quickly in due diligence realised the market wasn't really sports products. The market was in defence and aerospace. So back and forth a little bit with the CSIRO initially to figure out the agreement we did with them. I didn't want sports products. I wanted a whole gamut of industries, everything from shipping, marine, defence, aerospace and sports products too. They finally agreed to those terms and then we got things going. That was a few years in that process as far as getting the confidence in the technology that we could do something. Cold spray had been around since the 80s, but it was actually stuck in this academic sort of scientific profile, not really having much commercial maturity or implementation. The TRL levels, the technical readiness level was quite good, but no one had any manufacturing level. At that time, the only tech it was being used for was in Japan to spray rice cookers with a specialised coating. So we saw the great opportunity there to move forward and really, so then that kicked off understanding a bit more around patents, but also how to raise capital around a new idea. I'll leave it there for a minute.
Excellent. Well, one thing I think it might be useful to talk about is the invention side. You mentioned that cold spray had been around for a while, but marching it up the technology readiness level and making a useful product is a long way from invention. Could you sort of clear up who is responsible for the development? There were the CSIRO, there was yourself, there was a Professor Fox who I've never met, but I've seen his name around. Who invented what with Titomic? Could you give us some clarity on that?
So Professor Richard Fox, he was my business partner, which was a strange thing. He was one of the top oncologists in Australia, and he's still today, I think, chairman of the Australian Oncology Association. He's in his 80s, early 80s now, but we've always had a very good, strong relationship with each other. Even though he's come from the medical fraternity, he loved innovation and technology and was a big proponent in cancer therapeutics as well, looking at technology. Him and me, we had a lot of support. He was one of our initial first backers through our Force Industries company doing the skis and the snowboards. And that was through his son, Tim Fox, that was also involved in that as well, who happened to be one of Australia's top professional snowboarders at the time. So I'd hooked up through Tim. I was sponsoring him as one of my athletes. And then through his father, saw the opportunity to invest too. So we built a strong relationship over the years. So when we had the opportunity, came to Force Industries for the cold spray, Richard was my partner already. So we both jointly worked with the CSIRO in developing that capability. I then, because I'd come back from China in 2008, worked full-time with the CSIRO on looking at the technology, but most importantly, they didn't really know too much about the robotics at the time, which is fair enough. There's different compartments in the CSIRO. They were great in this cold spray technology, but I had to bring across the robotics. So I worked with them for quite a while developing the robotics to be able to give us that capability to make the different products and create the pathways. And so that was the initial part. But then we wanted to create a patent around that. So me and Richard came up with a patent concurrently together with each other, but we also put that in the hands of the CSIRO at the time because we felt it was very hard to validate the level of technology. And we felt like if we're going to raise capital, we need to have some strong IP protection behind what we were doing. At the time back then, CSIRO had just won the large Wi-Fi international case about they were the inventor of Wi-Fi. And that created a huge precedent as far as don't mess with the CSIRO's IP, right? So we came up with this idea, well, we're the inventors of the patent, but let's bring CSIRO and park the patent with them, then license it back. So it was favourable to the CSIRO agreement. So we had the protection of the CSIRO, but also had a way to get our patent on the market. What we also realised then, the fact of raising capital, having the credibility of CSIRO behind us, actually really helped for that first level. So that's really how it sort of got up and running. So Richard was there as far as the ideas with us, as far as the patents and what we wanted to patent. But then I was the one that had to sort of do the hands-on work to actually realise it and make it real.
Let's consider sort of the company was founded, I think, in 2014 and listed a few years after that. Tell me about the progress and sort of what pathway you went along and, eventually listing, and whether or not that was the right thing to do at that stage of development.
Yeah, so the technology, we pretty quickly realised, I'm pretty cheeky, so I just approach a lot of the major primes in defence and aerospace, and just, sometimes that's the quickest way. Everyone gets a bit apprehensive, but I just knocked on their door, and I was actually surprised at the level of interest. So that led to some discussions with the UK government, who were trying to work with the titanium at the time. So very quickly realised the biggest play that we could do for Titomic when we first registered the company was to look at a play in the titanium. And that came about through one critical aspect. Was in 2008, the federal government of Australia did a large strategy around called Ore for More, where we have the largest resource of titanium in the world, but we sell it for titanium dioxide, which is your white pigment. And I was always pushing around these value chains there. If we can turn that into a metal and build a viable industry, we knew the aerospace and the defence industry use huge quantities of titanium. The largest supplier of the titanium in the world was China and Russia. We thought, okay, this is great for the West and great for basically the concept of AUKUS as well. Unfortunately, trying to get people to understand that the magnitude of that opportunity kept falling short. The UK government actually had more interest than the Australian government, because they were looking at how they could use titanium powder to make aerospace defence parts and move away from this reliance on Russia to supply the large bits of titanium raw material. So obviously our initial focus then was on working with titanium. The UK government had spent, we believe, over £20 million developing a sintering process, which is called a canning process. I won't go into too much detail on that, but they'd blown a lot of money and couldn't get it really working well. So they looked at our technology as being a bit of a threat to them. So in the end, they ended up offering me and Richard about £4 million just to buy our patent office. And that was it. They were just going to buy it off us to park the patent, because they saw it as a threat. We also saw that it was a great opportunity. We ummed and ahed and thought, well, if they're willing to do that, there's got to be more value associated with that. Whether that was a good decision or a bad decision, I look back now and saying, if I was in it for the cash, I would have just cashed in that point. But I wasn't in it for the cash. I was trying to really build sovereign capability for Australia and use high-level technology as well. So that then put us down the path of just basically doing the circuit with the finance people in Australia, the venture capital, the brokers, trying to raise the money to get the company up and running. We kept going sort of nowhere to that point. We managed to get a grant off the government at that time, a Commercialisation Australia grant, that allowed us to look into the capability of the technology and where we felt it had its best fit. So definitely helped having that government grant, really helped to define go-to-market strategy was going to be, and also to be able to engage an external consultants to look at the market size of what we're playing into and maybe the best direction to go. So that, because that was published in government records and so forth, we got approached by a company out of South Australia called Innovyz, who are innovation specialists. And just so happened I got along with them really well. I'm not a big fan too much of startup bootcamp types, but at the same time, when you're desperate for money, you'll look at whatever opportunity there. And so we worked with them. I was a tough negotiator. They wanted a lot of money up front. I said, guys, I haven't got money to pay you, but I'm happy to do some in-kind equity play with you guys. So we end up signing up for that bit. Anyway, they helped us look at the commercial strategy. We spent another year and a half with Innovyz going around to different brokers to finally find a broker that actually looked at listing it. And the reason we went down the road of the broking companies was because we had the large play in defence and aerospace with the titanium. So three factors that had a lot of interest with that large investment type of fraternity. That said, we couldn't raise the money for VC or other areas we tried. We just didn't fit any of their eligibility or what they wanted. So the only option we actually had to raise the capital to get the company up and going was to actually go to a public listing. Now, when we did list, all we actually had, so from 2014 to 2017, was just doing all our due diligence, getting everything lined up in a row, and doing it pretty much on a shoestring budget as well. But then when we got to that point where we had a lot of interest in a company called Pack Partners in Melbourne, we're a boutique company that listed on the ASX, smaller company. We worked really well with them. They are very passionate like us about what we were doing. So it was a great opportunity for us to really push and work closely with that team and build that capability. So obviously to do a listing, all we had was the patent. So we had to do quite a large prospectus on the capability of the company. And it was a lot of blue sky, but at the same time where we could, we put a proper valuation, had done audited on the value of the company to figure out where the true value is. But we went to market with nothing more than a patent. And that patent we had, and then we managed to, that first phase, I think we raised, pre-IPO, had to raise about $2 million. And then we raised another, I think, 8 after that. So effectively, we started about $10 million to get that money into the company, which was great. It allowed us to then bring the right people on board and build that initial capability. So really, that's how it sort of all started. And then the next bit was a particularly interesting journey after that first phase.
You mentioned the sort of only way you could get in due to a lack of venture capital support was to list. Do you have any thoughts on, I guess you were limited with your options, but any thoughts nowadays on the ASX being the right or wrong place for a company that needs patient capital? And I know there are some different opinions on this. What's yours?
Hindsight's a wonderful thing, as they say. So I look back, understanding what went well and what didn't go well. I think it's still for large capital, for a big technology to really see its commercialization to a high level. I think you need to access that large level of capital. I think in Australia, we tend to think local, not global. What that means is, I think the latest output is over 95% of manufacturing in Australia is SMEs, right? And their thing is like how they're going to pay their payroll each week, right? Things are a lot tougher than what people realize out there. So there's definitely a disconnect between the large money end of town and actually the reality of manufacturing in Australia. And unfortunately, they don't gel together, right? And the only time they really gel together, if you've got huge export opportunity or huge sales, right? Otherwise, there's just not that appetite to engage in investment into manufacturing in Australia. And I believe the reason for that is we just don't look at the scale of what things can do. We're not very good at vertical integration in Australia or circularity. And the reality is we have the best resources in the world, mineral resources, energy resources. What we're doing with energy is just abhorrent, what we're allowed to happen. And the same with our minerals. Like you look at the titanium industry. When I looked at the last report back in about 2020, the titanium dioxide selling for hundreds of dollars a ton. If you sell titanium powder, it sells for millions of dollars a ton, right? It's not rocket science here, right? But we continually don't find value in things. I reference that back to 2 factors that create this situation. One is in Australia, we have this tall poppy syndrome and a bit of a colonialism type of attitude, right? Where we continue to bow to our parents, which I call the US and the UK. So we're still stuck, whether we like to believe it or not, in this colonialism. We just don't like standing on our own 2 feet. And then touch on top of that, our culture in Australia, our tall poppy culture, very driven still by that slave mentality. Don't say that, you'll get us all in trouble, right? So what that does, anyone that has a go and tries hard is going to get put down. So it takes a particular level of tenacity and courage in Australia to really go through and build a business. And unfortunately, most SMEs, the failure rate is still ridiculously high. 60, 70% of most SMEs will fail in the first 18 months. So fundamentally, something's wrong there. And so when I look at really the key aspects of what Australia is really suffering from, it actually goes back to our history more than anything else, that we're still stuck in this colonialism, not standing in our own right and our own sovereignty. And then this sort of tall poppy syndrome we get in Australia, that anyone that is having a go tends to get put down or antagonised for having a go. So I think it's a tough time to navigate through that bit, right? And so there's no other way than just having the fortitude to just, I'm a very strong believer. If you believe in something and adamant about that, and as long as you keep your integrity and just tell the truth, you're going to go a long way. Sometimes patience is a virtue, and in manufacturing and building startups in Australia, it definitely takes that patience. To
continue with Titomic a little further, and I know you're keen to talk about your current main venture, Vortair, and we'll get to that, I promise. I just wanted to hear some thoughts from you on the last few years at Titomic. You had a few different roles and you eventually left. What did the end look like for you?
Yeah, so when I first came on board, I was acting as the managing director and the CTO. So I built that company up initially. But then I felt because we done the technical readiness level, we suffered in a lack of manufacturing readiness level. So I thought the best value I could give to my shareholders is putting my efforts into building the manufacturing capability of the company. Great to push the technology, but it's meaningless unless you can manufacture something and manufacturing economically viable with that technology. So I stepped aside and we headhunted to bring in a new CEO. We did that. It took us 2 or 3 CEOs before we found the right one, because I think it was a lot harder than they realized. And I think that was one of my first mistakes I made, believing that we could bring in very experienced European or American CEOs that had been involved with large multinational. But the biggest mistake I made was realizing they usually had 3,000 to 5,000 staff under them. At Titomic at the time, we had about 40 staff. So it's like, okay, do this. And I'd say to the CEO, look, we actually don't have the resources to be able to do this. So immediately I saw there was a disconnect between that high corporate level and what was fundamentally required to get a business commercial. So there's a huge gap. And I still think that is the valley of death between the founder's passion, what they know will work and what won't work, and then the expectations of the board and the senior executive suite as well. The hardest bit at Titomic was getting that balance through that area, which we really struggled over the years. So my focus was then put all my effort into being the CTO. So I did that for a while, but then the first CEO, that didn't really work out. So then I took back in and took on the role of CEO again to really develop it. And that was a good time for me because it allowed me to really work closely with large defense primes. We got right in the door with Boeing and all the major primes in Europe and in US as well. And then next thing we know, we had like 5 or 6 projects. And I think there's an amazing history. We can go back all in the public records of the different jobs we took on at Titomic and large companies, everything from printing a tank for General Dynamics. I only squashed the project because it was going to lose jobs for them, to working on, satellite thermal coatings that are flying now up in space, but then working on things like titanium tanks for hydrogen. So some very exciting projects, but they all came about by listening to those primes, finding where they had problems, where we felt this technology could best suit. And what we really learned out of that whole exercise was getting the big companies to actually admit that they actually had a problem in manufacturing, and then could our technology be a solution to that problem? So that's what I really excelled in that area. So I focused on that area. And while I was doing that, then the board also focused on, a bit more capital raising in that too. That led to then a larger capital raise, which we managed to pull off on the 28th of February, 2020, just before COVID hit. And we finalized a 20 mil raise there. And that would end up into a large contract to produce NATO defense parts. So that was going really well, that whole project. But then with COVID hitting, that sort of just slowed everything down greatly. So from that point on, then we brought in one of our main investors at the time. He wanted to bring in some of his own directors. Unfortunately, as a public company, you don't always have control at that board level, right? That's what we started to see. So even though I was like head down, bum up, getting the job done, I felt like there was not so much pressure on me, but it was a different direction they were going. They were looking at really how they could exploit the capital in the company without too much concern about having a commercially viable product to get out the door. And unfortunately, that's what I see with a lot of over-corporatization. Just the level of money, if you have that right bandwidth on your board, you can raise ridiculous amounts of capital behind that. But what we keep seeing in these large capital raises, does it eventuate into actually some commercial activity? And I think we did over-corporatize too quickly at Titomic, right? We should have had a more opportunity to do that organic growth. But unfortunately, I think COVID hitting us at that particular time and the whole pandemic, that really sort of created a bit of a slowdown for us as well.
Right. And of course, Titomic is a very different company now. And I'm guessing you probably feel a bit of sadness at the fact that they look like they're an American company very much. I mean, they even refer to themselves as a leading American manufacturer. And I don't know what they retain in Australia, but I'm guessing it's not what it was. Could you please tell me about your feelings?
Obviously, like any baby you build yourself, you don't want to see it lost. But at the same time, I'm pragmatic in being a realist as far as understanding the bulk of the market for us was in the USA and Europe. So to really encourage manufacturing in aerospace and defense in Europe, they don't like imports. You have to be manufacturing on the ground in the US. So all the concepts that are still in play now are still work I did. So even plans I came up with 5 to 6 years ago are still the implementation plans that they're still following through on now. So I'm very happy to see they're still following that strategy we had, which was our manufacturing to market strategy. So that's working quite well, but obviously it takes longer than what we realised. Normally any new tech in defence and aerospace industry is 8 to 12 year process, right? So we're less than that time. It would have been quicker without COVID, but I still believe, and I got acknowledged by the US government too, as far as implementing a new titanium technology in record time. And they said the last time it was done was 1972. So that earned a lot of favours with the US government. So we very quickly realised at Titomic our future market was the USA. So we wanted to set up a base facility over there. But then once I sort of generally didn't disagree with the direction the board was taking, I still wanted to build the sovereign capability for Australia. But I think we started getting a lot more interest on the board from the US. So obviously they followed where the money was, and the money at the time was in the US. So that's why we went down that path. I left the company in 2022. Basically, sort of like anything, you never, let's just say, you never get sacked in a corporation, but you might get forced to resign. So I won't say too much more other than it was generally around me not wanting to get the job. Right. So I just won't say anything more than that, but really that led to it. But I also felt I was stagnating. There was a lot of frustration that wouldn't follow pathways that I sort of recommended we had the knowledge on, and it became more focused on just raising capital. That said, I stayed in there, stayed in contact with all the people involved, and then even sought reassurance that we keep the head office in Australia and everything fine. The board said, yeah, fine, we'll stay in Australia. So then when I saw that we were moving to the USA with the new CEO coming on board, but fine, I sort of understand that bit. But what upset me the most was when I saw a post that Titomic put up in the public saying we're moving all our manufacturing to the US plant now. And that's probably what hit the hardest. I built a fantastic team of engineers and tradies in Australia building the equipment in Australia. Obviously, we import some of the spray guns and robotics, but it was an amazing capability we built in Australia. And to see that get lost and taken overseas, and especially the Americans, a little bit of arrogance on the American side, oh, that's easy to do. I'm going, it's not easy to do at all, right? Obviously, I'm still a major shareholder, so I still want to see the company hugely successful. I think it's got a basically average market cap of about 400 mil. So I'm still proud of building something from 0 to a 400 mil market cap. But probably the most upsetting thing I've seen is recent announcement where they say Titomic made in Alabama. so I think, how do you sort of even digest that bit? So it is a bit of a slap in the face, that bit. It's so hard to build capability with Australian investors, great Australian technology representing sovereign capability to then watch that go offshore. So it is very upsetting, but at the same time, you've got to be pragmatic. The world moves on and no point crying over spilt milk. It's happened, and great, the company's still up and running and it's great technology and it'll continue to develop. But I am sort of still a bit upset and a little bit sour that we lost it to America.
Yeah, well, I share some of that. Obviously, I'm nowhere near as involved as you, and I'm just a spectator, but I can understand the feeling. Before we move on from that topic, let's try and focus on, I guess, the positives or at least the lessons. Do you think that there's anything we could do better as a nation to avoid such losses of manufacturing? There are plenty of other examples I can think of where the Yanks have grabbed great technology from Australia that's taken many years to develop and it's just being lost after we do essentially the very, very hard work of climbing those early TRL levels. Is there a lesson in this for us?
Yeah, well, I think when you talk to people around sovereign capability, everyone wants to talk. We come back to that Aussie tall poppy syndrome again. Everyone wants to point the finger and blame someone. And the reality is that it's the collective that's to blame, right? People want to blame the government. Oh, you didn't give me free money, right? The government's not going to hand out free money to people. And then they go, oh, it's too hard to get money out of venture capital, out of this. Well, no, if you have the right product, you can get the money. So all these problems are, let's say, are opinions. But when you add up all these opinions, it just goes into the too hard a basket. So the problem we have in Australia is, and look, government, I've had a lot of support off the government. So I'm not going to say anything negative really about the government other than that they play into the lobbyists, right? And whoever's got the most money is going to lobby the government the hardest. The politicians just doing their job, but the lobbyists is what have the biggest influence in Australia. It's unfortunate that the mining sector don't see value in, look at BHP's classic example, right? Used to be a large steel manufacturer as well as the iron ore, completely circularity, vertically integrated, but no money in them to make the steel here. So now, instead, we started selling all the oil and coking coal to China, And effectively, China's built their GDP based off Australia's coking coal and iron ore. And like how the government can't see that. So I started getting frustrated and I dug into that quite a bit deeper. So I joined a group called ADC, Australian Davos Connection, that gave me connections into understanding what was happening at the higher level within government and also within UK and US as well. That's when I really started to look upon just really how much influence there is from the UK on Australia still with our minerals, how much influence on America on our manufacturing as well. What's lacking in Australia, it really comes back to one thing, what I mentioned earlier, is having the fortitude. And sometimes with that fortitude, there's got to be a bit of arrogance and antagonism with it, but just having that fortitude to push through. You know, look at some of the people that are actually really doing that well. And I look at Twiggy, for instance, from Fortitude. You know, he's doing that, right? He doesn't get everything right all the time, but he's pragmatic in the fact he's really pushing what he believes in. Helps that he's got very deep pockets to be able to do that. But I think what we're lacking in Australia is leadership from industry. It's not leadership in government. It's not leadership through Industry, Austrade do amazing jobs, all these people. It's leadership from industry that we're lacking. Someone told me there's over 3,000 industry groups in Australia. Like, what the hell are they doing? They're taking manufacturers' money and people's money, but what are these industry groups doing? Why do we have 3,000 groups? What are they actually doing with the members' money? You know, it's like, this is where it falls over, right? So an industry group is meant to be representing the best interests of an industry, but I don't feel they are in Australia. For instance, after the Second World War, we had the largest stainless steel fabrication capability in the world. And it was great for a while. And even in Melbourne, we had huge capability in that sheet metal. I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, more sheet metal machines were bought in Melbourne than any other region in the world. Now that industry is completely lost off. And now you try to make a stainless steel part in Melbourne, you can't compete against China because the Chinese government is now subsidizing the cost of stainless steel to manufacturers in China. So it's just crazy on that bit. But really, it comes back to leadership and also playing in what is your value proposition. Australia's value proposition is we should have the cheapest energy in the world. We don't. If we had the cheapest energy based on our resource, we'd be a powerhouse in manufacturing because our energy costs would be lower. And then combine that with our ability to process resource in Australia from resource to material and then to processing into manufacturing. Everything's sitting there. It's just no one's really connected the dots. And I think through the modernisation of Australia and where the world went globally, I think we've lost the plot a little bit. So I think it's now time to redress what we need to do to build that sovereign capability. But what's lacking is the industry leadership. I'm not going to point the finger at anyone else other than the leadership of industry.
If you want to make a case, you have to make it yourself. And I don't see very much strength in terms of lobbying for manufacturing in Australia. I can think of one group that represents the big end of town, Manufacturing Australia. It's very rare that you hear any communications whatsoever from them. And I really don't see very many groups speaking out on behalf of the industry's interests, except in a really piecemeal way every now and then. On to happier things, you clearly seem to be, if not a dude that enjoys startup boot camps, then at least a guy that enjoys or is happy to form or join startups and get new businesses with high ambitions off the ground. Tell me about what looks like it's the main venture among a few, and that's Vortair. Tell me about joining that company and the innovation behind what it does.
So I'm always on the eye for new technologies. And when I was at Titomic, the CSIRO put me onto a technology that they found in Melbourne, where they're looking at taking swarf and manufacturing, mainly titanium swarf. We have a very large capability in Victoria and other areas as well, machining titanium components for aerospace. Some very large manufacturers doing that. Huge amount of titanium swarf. One aerospace part might start as a 1 ton component and ends up 110 kilograms. So you got 890 kilograms of material gets machined away. That material getting machined away generally was just getting thrown out. So the CSIRO found a company that could take that swarf and turn it into a powder in this amazing sort of milling technology. It's called autonomous grinding. So it's basically like a tornado effect. You put material in this tornado and it's like it breaks the covalent bonds of material. So it's basically more of a frequency breaker, but at the end of the day, it's just like a tornado of air spinning around. The material within that hits itself and actually reduces in size. We have some controlling mechanisms as far as the particle size, what we do there. So the CSIRO were very interested in this technology. They tried to license it off the old inventor and his business partner. And these guys were classic Aussie, tradies and just Saw the opportunity they had, but more happy every day to just put some new material in the machine to see what it would mill rather than actually trying to get a commercial play out of it, right? So CSIRO tried to license the technology off them. That went nowhere. They sent me out to have a look at it. They're more interested. We went to buy, Titomic made an offer to buy the technology. The two business partners, it was a good deal. We actually offered them 1.5 mil for their patent and the technology. I rocked at the meeting with the check, had board approval. The dodgy business partner of the two, he decided to change the price to $5 million. So I just closed everything up and walked out of the meeting. So that then led to those two partners having a fallout with each other. The company went into liquidation, then they had to wait 3.5 years for it to get out of liquidation. So I went back to the original founder, which was Axel Andre. It was the inventor. He's in his early 80s now, right? Amazing engineer, done just an amazing career in engineering. And so we worked with him, I had to finish the patent with him. I ended up financing the patent through. So then we had something solid there. And then we started Vortair on that bit. So that was I think we registered the company in 2024, but effectively we got our first bit of capital I put into the business that was about March 2024. We got the company up and running. And effectively, we lucky in getting a large manufacturer. The company doesn't like me mentioning their name, but let's just say one of the world's largest manufacturers of tomato products and baked beans. And we put a system in New Zealand. And it was a very interesting start because we had some people that already built the first prototype machine, but we also had to make it a bit more commercially viable and also make sure it was safe and hit all those audit points. So that client said, look, we've got our tomato season's running out. We've got 10 weeks left. Can you build something? And I said, well, we can try, but what we end up doing, rather than just milling a dry powder, we built a whole production system that does tomato powder and could actually process whole tomatoes. We built the whole system onto a skid, and we found the largest size of a skid that I could fit in the back of a commercial aircraft, which was, I think, 2.7 by 2.3 meters. We built the whole thing in 6 weeks, got it on the airline and freighted it to New Zealand and had it there for the end of their season and hit the mark. So that was a really good start. Obviously, I upset a few people on the pace I work at, but either way, we delivered to a large multinational our first commercial system that worked amazingly well, right? So everything we said it would do, it worked. Obviously, we had a few little bugs in commissioning it, but the system works and it's still up and operational now. But more importantly, that's now revolutionized how you can process tomatoes. So obviously, one of the things we looked at before, when you process tomatoes, there's generally about a 30% waste in the seed and skins, right, that don't go into your tomato sauce and pastas and things like that. So we found a way to take that waste that was going to landfill and turn that into a high-value tomato powder that could then be sold as its own product as a powder. That said, we also thought, well, let's try liquid in the machine. Even though it was a dry milling machine, I had this concept because we used to wash the machine by putting water in it, and then we thought, okay, let's give it a try that way. So we managed to put solid tomatoes through the machine and we created a puree. The advantage we had there, all of a sudden, the seed and skins could stay in the product. So instead of having to pulp the tomato, pull the seed and skins out, we could keep the seed and skins in the tomato as it went through our machine. Even though it was a liquid phase, we milled the solids in the seed and skins down to very small, under 50 microns, which means they could stay in the product. That did two things. It increased the nutritional value of the tomato because all the nutrients are in the seed and the skins. But most importantly, from an economics perspective, we got rid of that 30% waste that was going to landfill, actually pumped their throughput up by 30% and for the same amount of input. So it was a win-win across everything. So it's a great example with this technology as far as everywhere we apply this technology, whether it be in food processing or processing food waste or even in general waste, we look at the economics of scale. And all the case we've come up with, the longest we've seen the CapEx as far as return on an investment is 18 months. So when we tend to looking at waste materials, it's costing companies a lot of money getting rid of waste. And so turning waste into value is a big bit of what we're doing at Vortair. But most importantly, just looking at areas that no one else wants to touch. So, it's been a phenomenal journey in the last year and a half, and we keep getting more and more capability known to the world. So we get more and more people knocking on our door, where everything from very large packaging companies are talking to us about recycling some of their used packaging. We've just done some very large things on curbside glass. Glass is a huge problem in Australia. We've been recycling glass now to the point we can now put the glass back into cement or even glazing on tiles in other areas And we're doing the curbside glass, the real nasty stuff, the commingled different colors. It's got aluminium and it's got plastic, paper mixed in with it as well. But we can separate those materials out. So finding these capabilities for this technology has been huge. And you've got a good technology when we don't necessarily have to market, people are knocking on our door. So it's a great position to be in. But once again, what I'm adamant about this time and passionate about sovereign capability, we're not going to lose this one out of Australia. It's going to stay firmly on the ground here.
You've mentioned a whole bunch of things just then that you can shred, starting with the experiments that the founders did before the company was formed, just throwing random bits of metal in and seeing what would happen. And you mentioned foodstuffs and waste and plastic and glass fines. Is the usefulness in how small the particles can be made or how precise they can be made? What's sort of the main secret, I guess, maybe if we could call it that?
And this is what I find very intriguing about this technology. It just has so many uses, right? So there's not one single use. So if we look in food, for instance, right? By reducing the particle size, it means we're getting a higher surface area of the particle. So that means things like increased nutrition and also increased secondary processes. So if you're trying to extract something chemically out of a material, the finer the particle, the more extracted out. So the food technology is very much interested as far as even not just waste, but just processing normal foods. We can increase the nutritional value of the food because it becomes more bioavailable to the stomach because there's smaller particles with the greater surface area. Then we look at waste companies, say, are doing biochar or doing microbial digestion to break down waste. If we basically reduce the volume, say we look at municipal solid waste, we put that through our machine, we can do all commingled waste, reduce the volume by up to 90% in volume. That immediately has a play for tips because we're reducing the methane level by 90% as well, but also the carbon by 80% as well. So huge minimization there just by milling the material down to a smaller particle size. But when we look at that in the secondary processes, such as digestion processes or biochar, because of the increased surface area, we reduce the time in their machines, which is great for them because they get a greater throughput through their machine. And allows their digestion, microbes to work quicker, allows the biochar, the heating to work quicker, so it makes systems more efficient. So we are working with a lot of those existing waste companies now to either enhance the input material from the first part, to reduce the size, to increase their process, but also a lot of the waste material they end up at the other end, where they're even working with some of the companies doing insects to digest the material, and we get the insect larvae, we mill that into a protein powder. Not that I really want to eat insects, but and then on the other level, we look at the biochar, that's a byproduct from the biogas through the pyrolysis system. So we can take that biochar, and we just had a huge breakthrough there, where we work with pyrolysis car tyres. And so we got that carbon, or it's not called biochar, it's called a char because it's made from originally rubber tyres. But we got that material and we did a project with Melbourne University and another private company. And we managed to create carbon black from that, which what that means, we increased the volume 5 times. And we got it's under 5 microns, and so very high level. So that then can be deemed as a new version of carbon black. And that company's looking at doing a circularity. So they recycle the car tyres, pull the biogas off it, get this black carbon off it, and then put that black carbon back into the new batches of tyres. So that's a really good circularity one there. But what we're ultimately trying to do is take biomass, which is generally from municipal waste or agricultural excess waste, and then we do the pyrolysis process, and then we get a biochar at the end of that bit. And then we process that biochar on our Vortair mill, and we create a carbon black. Now, that carbon black is what we call resource carbon black. All the carbon black used in the world in pigments, printed ink cartridges, women's mascara and makeup, all these things are made from petrochemical. It's a byproduct of producing petrol. So this will be the first resource carbon black in the world that's made from plant-based material. And what we have recently found out too, believe it or not, in your batteries, there's a lot of carbon black in batteries. So we've realized that we can immediately get to a purity level of carbon black, but it looks like we can take large volumes of agricultural biomass waste, biochar that, create a carbon black, and be a main supplier to the battery industry for this carbon black that goes in the batteries. So what I'm trying to do with this technology now, look where there's existing issues in the industry. where there's shortfalls and where this technology can piggyback maybe with other technologies to create a whole vertical integrated system to deliver zero waste from where areas before we had huge waste issues to now completely turning those waste into value.
That sounds like there's a huge range of potential, and it'll just be a matter of finding the right battles, among other things. You mentioned the company was just founded last year. How have you financed it so far, and are you looking to raise capital in the near future?
We're lucky that it had the organic growth. So even though I put an initial bit of dollars myself into the company, and then I had one of my other friends who was one of the early investors in Titomic as well. Between me and him, we've sort of financed that company privately ourselves. Both in the same situation we had with Titomic, we want to keep it private, right? So we've had no shortage. I've had huge amounts of brokers from Morgans, everyone else knocking on my door going, Jeff, we'd love to invest in a new project. I said, look, potentially we're looking at that bit, but we're going to keep the main part of the company as primarily a private entity. Then, because the technology has so many uses across so many different areas, we're going to create subdivision companies for different projects. And then those projects will bring in private capital. So, for instance, we've just also done a large turnkey seafood waste processing system where we take seafood waste, tuna heads, guts, a whole lot, put it through our mill, and we create what looks like tuna mornay. Not that you'd want to eat it because we see what goes in the first place, but that product has huge offtake potentially straight away with the pet food industry. So we're looking at a plant going up in Sydney, but we also did a big project with the Indonesian government to look at all their wet markets in Indonesia, putting one of these systems in their wet market. They're currently paying a fee to have that waste go off to the tip, but we figured out now the economics, we could process that waste in our system and then create a fish meal for aqua farming. Now that fish meal from that waste, we get over $2,000 a tonne. So automatically it became very, very viable project. It's still ongoing in further discussion, but that's when we've taken a waste that was previously and turned into a profit item, but also completely removed the waste out of that area. So once again, that would be a joint venture done on that project. So we're encouraging joint ventures because we don't necessarily say we have the expertise in across every industry sector. We have the expertise what we do in the milling, and we know its capability. So we are openly discussing joint ventures with different multinationals and even some smaller groups as well.
Shredding so much stuff, some of it probably quite tough on the machines, means that it's probably going to be a challenge making these things as durable as possible. Tell me about assembly of the machines and some of the thinking to do with making them robust.
When I first got involved, that was the first thing to get it commercially viable and make the machines safe. So they were made originally food safe for that industry. So it has to be particularly grades of stainless steel. When I first got involved, there was probably 20 bolts inside the grinding chamber. So I had to redesign that to a monocoque rotor, no bolts inside. So that was a bit tricky to get that done. We don't want a food recall because if a bolt loosens in the thing, that bolt will turn into powder and end up in your food. And then you don't want a whole food recall. So we made it quite safe on that level. But then obviously, like anything, when you're looking at mass production, you've got to secure that supply chain, have a very solid bill of materials as well. So we then went out trying to find that right secure supply chain. So we found some really good suppliers up in Shepparton of all places that were very good in food technology. We had worked with SPC and the other companies up in Shepparton. So they're doing most of our fabrication local suppliers up there. We wanted to keep it Australian made, and as much as I want to support regional, it was a business decision. They were 30% cheaper than Melbourne. So I'm just being completely transparent there. But look, they've been fantastic dealing with the guys up in Shepparton. Elephant Design's the main one, waterjet cutting, and JMR Engineering. They do some fantastic work for us. Then the next bit was just the motor, securing the right motors. So we worked with SEW Eurodrive, and SEW is one of the largest motor companies in the world. The thing I like about SEW, the CEOs come from the factory floor and build his way up. So I have meetings with him and he can reel off part numbers to me and understand the technology. And that's always very helpful, even if it is a large multinational company, that the CEO actually understands their product. So that was my first task, build that robust, secure supply chain. And we're just now in the process of working with Australian Made, which was a very interesting story there to try to get Australian Made designation on our machines. They go, oh, no, you have all these materials you're importing from overseas. And I go, yeah, but we're making the machines in Australia. So it took a bit of back and forth to be able to justify that, but they've now accepted that. So we're in that process now at the moment, getting an Australian Made, Australian owned designation behind the machine. But more importantly, when we think about selling these machines globally, number one, can we produce large volumes of the machine locally? And then if we are exporting them overseas, how do we manage the service and maintenance? Some of the things I learned at Titomic, working with large companies like Siemens and other groups like that, you want to be able to rely on someone else's service and maintenance to be able to, address service and maintenance with your clients. And that's where SEW Eurodrive helped us greatly. We get the motors off them. We get their VSD drives, which allows us to have digital control of their motors. But we also took a bit of a risk, and we're running with their new HMI, which is the interface control system. So we've got a one-stop shop on that whole control mechanism. Automation and robotics can get quite interesting, and I tend to have a bit of a problem with a lot of robotics and automation people because they never finish the job. Right? So I think one of the advantages we've got doing the SEW Eurodrive, they're very good in what they say they're going to deliver, they deliver. So we've got really good secure supply chain now. So now we're just in that capability to grow and building our capability on that. But ultimately, we want to continue to manufacture these machines in Melbourne and Australia and export them out of Australia.
That's a good story, and it's good to hear a mention of SEW because they're kind enough to sponsor us, and I'm sure they'll appreciate the mention and getting their money's worth. Anyway, so we've used up quite a lot of your afternoon, so I might call it a wrap in a couple minutes. I'll just ask the standard closing question, Jeff, just before we say goodbye. What's your sort of, pet issue, if you will, if it hasn't been covered already? What's to you an issue that isn't getting the attention it deserves when it comes to manufacturing?
In Australia, I think it's a tricky one. It's what I would call vertical integration, right? If you've got to have partnerships, right? You might have a great technology, great idea, but if you don't have an offtake for what you're going to be producing, don't even bother starting, right? Start backwards from where there's a problem in an industry that they need a particular product or need a service. Once you understand that, you work backwards from that point. I see too many startups, amazing, very passionate about their idea, but they don't spend enough time on determining is there a market for my product or my invention. So I think my last thing I can probably say to any inventors out there, people wanting to set new manufacturing or business up, make sure you have a secure end offtake that that will buy your product and want that product. Otherwise, you'll just be pouring money in to try to find that market.
Yep. I don't know. A man much smarter than myself once said something about the most important thing a business can generate is a customer. And if you don't have that, then good luck to you. Anyway, Jeff, it's been delightful catching up with you, and I appreciate you donating your time to this podcast. Great to talk.
No, I appreciate the time, and thanks again, Brent.
Awesome. Thank you.